Hey guys, welcome back to my endless series of knocking the later seasons of Game of Thrones. There is one aspect about the show that I haven't gone into enough detail about yet, and that is the action. I think it is very overrated, and there has been a false consensus that at least the action in Season 8 was good. But even some of the coolest action scenes in the season are flawed. So I want to take a closer look as to what the problem is with each of the action scenes and determine what they did wrong. So taking a look at the first main action sequence in Season 8, we'll be analyzing the Long Night. This is undeniably the worst out of all the action in the season, and there are 4 main issues as to why that is. First, let's start out with the most simple problem, the lighting. So a common rule in action is that you want to see the action, but when you can't see the action, you tend to have problems. Most action scenes that are shrouded in darkness tend to make up for a lack of quality, and that quality generally includes choreography, stunt performance, and any special or visual effect. The reason why the lighting was so dark was to cheat these fundamentals in action and give you something more half-assed. There could have been many reasons as to why it was half-assed, but I think the main reason is because of the budget. To create an hour and 20-minute battle episode with just about $20 million, the filmmakers probably had to find some shortcuts. There are a crazy amount of VFX shots required for the beginning onslaught of whites and dragon combat, so the only logical way to save money is to obscure everything. But because of that, the end product was thereby horrible.
Here is about $20 million. We just want clear action for the audience.
We can put that check in a money market mutual fund. Then we'll reinvest the earnings into foreign currency accounts with compounding interest, and it's gone.
What?
It's gone. It's all gone.
What's all gone?
The money in your account. It didn't do too well. It's gone.
To put into perspective, Taken 3 was made for $48 million. So the Long Night episode had a bigger challenge to overcome because of its scale, and I don't really think they overcame that challenge. Since there is so much darkness, the filmmakers can just throw in a bunch of mediocre action that we can't see or judge. Also, it's not like night battle episodes haven't been done in the past on this very show. For example, you could still see the action in Blackwater, and you could still see Mance Rayder's army rushing the wall. For these episodes, they knew exactly what they could pull off, and they didn't have to taint the end product because of budgetary reasons or time. However, in the Long Night, whether it was actually budgetary issues, or David and Dan were just so unbelievably stupid, they ended up ruining the whole episode. The lighting may seem like the most damning reason as to why the action in the Long Night was so bad, but I'd argue that the other issues with this episode are much worse. For the next issue, let's talk about how jarring the action is. Even if you turn up the brightness to see the action, it is way too hard to follow. For some of these shots, we are literally getting about 16 cuts per 10 seconds, which is crazy. That basically makes everything like an incomprehensible mess. And I even found out from slowing the footage down that they turned one of these shots upside down, and you thought it was already jarring enough. Like, we understand that the whites are ferocious, but you don't have to use extremely fast editing to deliver that message. Because of this, it makes the action just feel unenjoyable and jarring to watch. That is one of the major reasons why the Long Night was so underwhelming. People complain about the Long Night not being long enough, but the execution of the action is much worse. For example, if we look at Hardhome, which deals with a lot of whites, it doesn't feel jarring at all. The scene is well choreographed and each shot has an actual purpose. It's okay to have some quick shots of action that are out of context to establish the chaos in the scene, but you also need choreographed action with longer takes. This is what Hardhome does so well. They find a perfect balance in making the action feel chaotic, but not chaotic enough to lose the audience. And this is how the Long Night fails. Every shot just feels like noise and is chaotic for the sake of being overwhelming and chaotic. There is a complete lack of choreography. Really, one of the only extended choreographed fight scenes in the whole episode is with Arya, and that's not enough to create a nice balance in the action. Like, it's much easier to have random people dying everywhere and to have practically no consistency instead of having actual fight scenes that take planning and time to accomplish. For example, we randomly go from Jaime getting jumped on to a different shot of Tormund getting jumped on, and we don't get any resolution as to what happens to them. Generally, in good action, you see both the action and the reaction in the same shot. Not just does the Long Night not show us the action and the reaction in the same shot, but sometimes they don't even show us the reaction as to what happens next. It just becomes very dull and uninteresting when you rely heavily on this method, on top of there being no lighting. So it seems like the action in Long Night can't get worse, but it does, and it gets worse through its presentation of characters. In each of the action scenes for the Long Night, the creators always present the characters in impossible odds in which the only logical outcome for them is death. This happens constantly, and the most notorious example is where everyone is in the courtyard surrounded and being swarmed by whites. In this situation, everyone should be dead, and the only reason why they are all alive is because of plot armor. This whole scenario destroys your suspension of disbelief because the whites are intentionally not killing the main characters. This degrades the whites' lethality and makes them seem like a joke. In this one shot, you see a white hugging Brienne, and in the behind the scenes, you see the most silly sight of whites patiently waiting to attack the main characters. It just makes the whole sequence seem like a joke. By not having your characters in realistic situations that they can overcome, then it creates a situation in which the characters succeed only because the plot demands it, and not because they could actually overcome it. This deteriorates the action because the characters are cheating their victory over each obstacle. For the last main issue about the Long Night, I want to go into the inconsistencies of the Antagonist. So right out of the gate, we are shown that the whites are extremely ferocious and deadly. They literally take out the entirety of the Dothraki in less than a minute. But all of a sudden, when it comes to any major character, they suddenly act inept and are useless. Like whites not being able to kill a fat, squabbling character who can't fight, who is other known as Samwell. Or even Jon Snow being surrounded by hundreds of whites after the Night King resurrected them. There is just a sheer inconsistency of danger that the whites portray. This breeds a lot of confusion as to what the whites are capable of and what their power level is. For most of the antagonists in the show, we have a clear understanding as to how dangerous they are. For example, with Joffrey, he is consistently cruel and tortures his subjects, and that comes to be expected whenever he's being dangerous. However, the whites could just be running over people like the undead horde from World War Z, or they could just be walking at someone. Their varying level of danger is so inconsistent that it literally confuses the audience as to how dangerous they are. And this hinders the action because the whites don't come off as a big challenge for our heroes, and overcoming challenges is a big part of action. So those are the 4 main reasons as to why I think the Long Night action sequence was horrible. So let's now take a look at the extended action sequence in King's Landing. I will look separately at the destruction of King's Landing, Jaime vs Euron, and Cleganebowl. First, let's take a look at the destruction of King's Landing. The primary issue that I have with the action in this whole sequence is that it is spectacle over depth. Yes, the VFX side of this whole sequence is very good and is very blockbustery and fun to watch, but it lacks the depth that the biggest story event in the show requires. All the depth we get from our characters is a sudden and unjustified turn from Daenerys that just confuses the audience. Stale and repetitive reaction shots from Cersei that are all interchangeable. A surprised Pikachu Tyrion. An Arya Stark that has 9 lives.
Let's get you back in the fight.
And an as usual confused Jon Snow. Characters, in essence, drive the story and action. Since they are all drowned out by the popcorn visual effects, it loses its weight and emotional impact. An example as to how it lacks depth from its characters is that we don't have any reaction shots of Daenerys while she is on her dragon burning down King's Landing. The juiciest part of this action scene isn't the explosions, but the turn of the Mad Queen. After all, this is the biggest twist of the season. Instead, we only get the explosions, and we don't see Daenerys for the rest of the episode. David and Dan basically just laid a carpet of visual effects over the fundamental heart of this whole action scene, and because of that, it feels more hollow. It's just pure spectacle, and a lot of the destruction turns into repetitive noise. Sure, they give us the point of view of Arya to see how bad the destruction is, but she's thereby granted plot armor to witness all of it. And through Arya's perspective, it doubles down on the spectacle side of the action scene and takes our focus away from the turn of the Mad Queen. Because of this, we miss out on the emotional core of this whole action sequence, which is Daenerys' turn. Sure, all the action in King's Landing is enjoyable, but since the characters are so drowned out, it loses its emotional punch, and the biggest event in the story is rendered more hollow from an over-reliance on spectacle. So going into a more objectively bad fight scene, let's take a look at the fight between Jaime and Euron. The reason why this is such an objectively bad fight scene is because it's riddled with errors and bad editing. The errors that I'm referring to are continuity errors. If anyone doesn't know, continuity means the practice of ensuring that details in a shot are consistent from shot to shot within a film scene, and this action scene breaks continuity. So let's take a detailed look. For this shot, Jaime gets pushed into a rock by Euron, and then in the next shot, he suddenly teleports behind Euron and slashes at him. Interesting. After that, Euron throws Jaime into the same rock, and we cut to a shot behind Euron, and for some reason, we don't see the rock or Jaime, and it seems as if Euron is even confused. And again, Jaime teleports behind Euron and tackles him. I don't know if that is a magical rock of teleportation, or if there are actually multiple continuity errors. But yeah, on top of the fast cuts, this action scene is pretty unbearable to watch. It's crazy how we have this fight scene in the same episode of Cleganebowl. It goes to show how little the creators cared about Euron and Jaime and put practically no effort into it. The actor who plays Euron said they had about 2 days to film the action, and it goes to show in the end product. Granted, the audience were probably just rolling their eyes at this point, but David and Dan could have at least made up for it with a good fight scene. So for the last action scene in Season 8, which is Cleganebowl, I don't think there's a lot wrong with it. I think it is genuinely a good action scene, and it is basically self-contained and doesn't have much to do with the rest of the story. Like hell, Cersei, the main villain, walks right by Clegane and he does nothing because the mountain is the villain in Clegane's story. The only issue I have with this action scene is that it cuts away when it gets the most interesting. I'm not talking about the cool intercut sequence between Arya and the Hound getting pummeled, but I'm talking about right when the fight gets into the epic swordplay, they cut away to Cersei bumbling around. When we get back to the fight, we have very little swordplay, and then we go straight into the getting pummeled section of the fight scene, and that's basically it. All the buildup of 8 seasons essentially amounts to a fight that lasts about 2 minutes with the inclusion of a cutaway. If the actual fight between the two characters was longer, we would have had more payoff, and the duel aspect could have been more reminiscent of the earlier seasons. These two characters deserved more well-choreographed action because they are the best fighters in Game of Thrones. Also, the Mountain has been sitting around for the past 3 seasons, so you think they would give us more action from his character to justify all that buildup. And that's really the only criticism I have for Cleganebowl. Besides that, I think the rest of the action scene is good. Although I'm not really here to talk about what was good, but instead look at all the issues in the action. But yeah, that basically encompasses most of the action in Season 8. The Long Night was just a complete mess with a lot of issues, while the destruction of King's Landing was enjoyable, but it still had some issues. Overall, the action has evolved greatly over the course of the entire show. The scale of it has increased significantly, and generally when you have to deal with higher scale action, it is much harder to pull off.